Section 1 of G.K. Chesterton in Vanity Fair magazine. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Larry Wilson. G.K. Chesterton in Vanity Fair magazine by G.K. Chesterton. The Next Renaissance. Thoughts on the Structure of the Future. 1. The Same Old Game. The whole modern way of making the world better, which is so scientifically designed to make it worse, can be clearly and compactly realized in the single case of sports or games. It is a fashionable and familiar example. It ought to be a frivolous and amusing example, but it is not. Sport is not so much a modern relaxation as a new religion, and is more serious and unsmiling even than most new religions. Philologists for the future will probably note the word golf as an alternative spelling of the word God. Philosophical historians of the future will probably explain that the goal in football was so called because it was recognized as the only goal of all human effort and desire. The records of baseball, rowing, and running groups will read like the records of monastic orders. There will be the shaving of the head, the starving of the body, the heroic and inhuman devotion to the brotherhood, and especially in the case of American colleges, the intoning of strange and unearthly litanies that seem to belong to another world. I do not mention this state of things in order to attack it. I have a great deal of sympathy and even reverence for superstitions. I have also what may seem a more serious reason for really reverencing the traditional or conventional games. Whatever their sins, at least they have not been international. It seems a pity that there has been anything in sport called the international. But in truth it is only very lately that these things have been touched with the decay called cosmopolitanism. The English national game of cricket is a very noble game, indeed, but perhaps it is primarily noble in being national. I have no doubt that baseball is equally noble, but on that I will observe a reverent silence for the very reason involved, that it is the sacred institution of another nation. I am barely old enough to remember, as a boy, playing golf in Scotland just before it was universally played in England. I can remember how consonant it seemed to the northern coasts, where links mean a landscape and not an apparatus. By comparison, there is something facetious about English links. It is as if the Alpine Club built an artificial Alp in Bedfordshire. But cricket, of which I can judge better, certainly has the note of the national, that is, of the unique and even the quaint. I wish top hats were still worn in the cricket field, so long as they were worn nowhere else. It is this unique note alone which is the real meaning of national independence. Freedom is freedom to play the fool in your own way, perhaps the finest game that a man can play. It is really right to defend this insular humor in arms, to defend bat and wicket with sword and cannon, not only against a vulgar and barbarous invader like the German emperor, but even against an enlightened and civilizing invader like the great Napoleon. It is not true, as Wellington said, that Waterloo was won on Eton cricket fields, but it is true, perhaps, that Eton cricket matches were saved and won at Waterloo. The serious business of sport. I say this at the start to make it clear that I value rightly the virile sports of our civilization. But lightly and logically considered, it is still strange that a man should be counted a sportsman because he refuses to take them in sport. He does not do them for his disport, as the old writers would have put it. He must play the game, and not play at the game. Still less must he play at playing at it. But that is how our more modern writers would probably express their meaning. He must take to his amusements not only eagerly, but earnestly. He must take his pleasures not only sadly, but almost suicidally. Now all this is on the face of it as unreasonable when applied to games on a holiday as it would be to games in a nursery. A man who really worries about his success at golf might just as well worry about his success at blind man's bluff. It would be interesting if a man could come in saying gloomily that he was off his game at Hunt the Slipper, or be cross with his wife and family for a week because he had been caught at hide and seek. Or we might have that moral idealization of all sport, in which some English schoolmasters indulge, applied to the sports of the most spirited time of life. We could have sermons on the comradeship, fair play, and fine sense of honor produced by playing the game, the admirable game of oranges and lemons. Or we should have a man saying sternly that something is not honeypots, as he says that it is not cricket. I have not only no desire to diminish sport, but rather, as will soon be seen, a desire to increase it. I would increase the vitality and especially the variety of games. But the first fact for the moment is that we have so entirely forgotten that games are games that it seems comic even to compare them to other games. It seems more natural to think of a gentleman engaged alternately in golf and government than in golf and leapfrog. Yet a man ought to be golfing in the mere mood and spirit of leaping, and governing in a different spirit altogether. As it is, the golf is solemn and the government frivolous, while politics become every day more slipshod, cynical, and irresponsible. Athletics, in this fashionable sense, becomes more rigid and more ritualistic. Yet it would be quite as reasonable to make Hunt the Slipper rigid and ritualistic, as no doubt it would be if it were fashionable. Indeed, if we follow its imaginary fortunes, we shall find them leading us to the important truth about the modern muddle called progress. Nursery games brought up to date. For instance, if nursery games were fashionable, the first thing that would appear would be apparatus. We should insult the very central sacred principle of "here we go round the mulberry bush" by actually introducing a mulberry bush. We should entangle oranges and lemons with wreaths and festoons of lemons and oranges, and probably of church bells also, hired especially for the purpose. The game of Tom Tiddler's ground would be vulgarized like a millionaire's freak dinner, with people picking up real gold and silver. A man playing Hunt the Slipper would carry a whole assortment of slippers, of all sizes and colors, as a man playing golf now carries a forest of clubs of all sizes and shapes. Or rather, he would have a servant walking behind him, carrying a whole sack full of slippers, like some fantastic sultan in the Arabian Nights. I can imagine the estate of some steel magnate or petrol king artificially laid out for hide and seek, with painted hiding places of tin and wood, conspicuous camouflage, and a great gilded hotel labeled Home. I will not insist on the point that the magnates of the commercial combines might find a verbal appropriateness in Puss in the Corner. Nor need I argue more generally that little boys who play robbers might learn to play financiers. The only point here is that when we talk today of the progress of a sport, we mean progress in these stiffening formalities. We mean progress in apparatus. In other words, we can only extend, continue, and complicate an old game. The one thing we never do, and this is the whole point, is really to start a new game. New games for old. Now a true land of liberty, if anyone seeks for a sign of it, would be one where a man might invent a new game. It would be one where he was not so entirely tied to the same old game. The more he extends it, the more he complicates it, the more it is the same old game. The only way to make a new game would be the way which made the old games, when they were new. It would be to make it out of anything, out of the merest thing. Thus, in my national case of cricket, the stumps were originally only the stool of the milkmaid. You make nothing new by making stumps larger, or more elaborate, or more artificial. The only parallel to the old invention would be to make a game out of something you have got. Let us say a door scraper, or an umbrella stand. It may appear difficult, merely by looking at an umbrella stand, to evolve a wild, fantastic game from it. Nevertheless, the wise social reformer will be wisest if he goes on looking at the umbrella stand until the vision is revealed to him. Of course, there are many other instances of the same aboriginal truth. The old game of tennis testifies by its very terms to having been played in the courtyard of an inn, with the scores based on the ordinary objects round, such as the buttery hatch. Alarm might be felt at first if such a game were suddenly invented, let us say, in a modern railway station, with so much scored by hitting the clock, and so much by hitting the station master. It would be yet more exciting if extended to the street, if the player made 15 by smashing a lamp post and 30 by busting a policeman. But this is perhaps to allow the merely imaginative and utopian side of social reform to run away with us. If the imagery be a little speculative, the ideal remains entirely serious. It is an ideal I shall attempt later on to apply as a test to more serious subjects, indeed to all the most serious subjects of the day. What is the matter with modern reform is that it is never in any true sense original. It never begins at the beginning, or makes any attempt to realize how things begin. At any rate, it is with this one lighter instance of sports and games that I begin, and with this, for the moment, that I end. End of section 1. Section 2 of G.K. Chesterton in Vanity Fair magazine. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Larry Wilson. G.K. Chesterton in Vanity Fair magazine by G.K. Chesterton. The New Renaissance. Thoughts on the Structure of the Future. 2. The Machine of Tomfoolery. There is one main modern defect which I have tried already to suggest. It is that our tools cannot turn into toys. It may seem fantastic to say that a finer work would remain, even when we had beaten our swords into plowshares, of beating our plowshares into playthings. Yet this paradox, as I have pointed out, really existed in simpler societies. Cricket began by throwing a ball, or perhaps a stone, at a stool, the three-legged stool of the milkmaid, possibly in the first and purest age of Arcady, while the milkmaid was sitting on it. For the priestess sitting on that tripod was still too divine to be dignified. The oracles she would deliver under such circumstances would be free and full of nature. But it is needless to insist further that modern machinery is less adapted to such spontaneous sports. Obviously, for instance, we should be less casual and hilarious if we were dealing not with an old English stool for milking a cow, but with a modern Chicago machine for cutting up a pig. One cannot toy playfully with such a machine. It would too easily become a machine for cutting up players. One cannot use the machines as a pantomime sausage machine, as one can use the tool for the game of stool ball. It is not only too complicated, it is too correctly designed for its own end to be twisted easily to any other end. Everyone knows, or ought to know, that great prose poem of American humor, Max Adela's description of the convertible domestic instrument which could be used for a ladder, an ironing table, or a settee. But the tale was a tragedy, and few attempts are really made to turn it into a triumph. As a matter of fact, scientific appliances very seldom are made to serve utterly different purposes, as a stool or stone or stick serve utterly different purposes. And certainly they can seldom be made to serve the purposes of an entirely improvised game on an unexpected holiday. The modern worker cannot idly take the works to pieces to enjoy them in their simpler forms. The artisan can seldom play the amateur, as the artist can play the amateur. The railway guard can hardly take a wheel off the railway train and bowl it as a hoop. The engine driver can hardly take the railway whistle away with him into the woods and pipe at his pleasure, like a boy with a whistle made in the woods. Even a bricklayer does not play with bricks as a child plays with bricks. Even a house painter does not play with paints as a child plays with paints. Yet the ordinary medieval mason who carved the grotesques on the Gothic cathedrals might truly be said to play with stone. And if, as some hold, they were painted also, it was probably in the same spirit of painting the town red. Being amused versus amusing oneself. Something has come between the man and his materials, of which the effect here involved is this: that the same materials used for a serious purpose cannot be molded to a more frivolous purpose. I have already emphasized the first example, that nobody makes a new game out of a normal everyday object. Nobody makes a game out of an umbrella, as our fathers made it out of a stool. I will now pass from the simplest example of games to the problem of more pretentious arts, of which a fair example is the drama, or even its more recent version of the cinema. It is already a commonplace concerning the masses of men in the modern cities that they are recklessly resolved to amuse themselves. But if I had to make a comment, I should say that they never amuse themselves at all. They are amused, which is very nearly the opposite. To amuse oneself is a mark of gaiety, vitality, and love of life. To be amused is a mark of melancholy and a potentiality of suicide. The former means that a man's own thoughts are attractive, artistic, and satisfying. The latter means that his own thoughts are ugly, unfruitful, and stale. And the happiness of a people is not to be judged by the amount of fun provided for them. For fun can be provided as food can be provided, by a few big stores or shops. The happiness of the people is to be judged by the fun that the people provide. In healthier ages, any amount of fun was really provided by the people, and not merely for the people. It was so in a vast multitude of songs, fairy tales, and dances. But it was so even in the more ornate and official business of the drama. The men of the medieval guilds enacted in person the miracle plays, with all their highly colored symbolism of the mysteries of heaven and hell. I have the fullest political sympathy with the modern trades union, but I confess I cannot easily imagine a railway porter feeling quite comfortable in the costume of the Archangel Gabriel, or even a plumber getting the full delight out of being the devil. Yet it must have been a very pure delight to be the devil. There was any amount of gagging and grotesque impromptu in such a part, for the medieval men were quite without the modern reference. That is, they were quite without the modern reference for the devil. The carpenter or cobbler who had the happiness of acting Caiaphas used to borrow a cope or a chasuble from the parish church. And I earnestly hope that the Archbishop of Canterbury would now lend his apron and gaiters to a dustman for such a purpose. But the only point here is that numbers of ordinary poor people acted, and there was nothing to prevent it being done in every town and even every village. I dare say they acted as badly as Bottom the weaver. But I am not talking about art, but about amusement. Above all, I am talking about people amusing themselves, and not only being amused. None will dare deny that Bottom the weaver amused himself even more than he amused his audience. Certainly that great man did not stoop merely to be amused. Indeed, to amuse Bottom would be a bold and almost blasphemous undertaking, in which all the frolics of the fairies failed. Shakespeare was probably thinking of the hard-handed man whom he may have seen thus acting the last of the medieval plays, as he was almost certainly thinking of the traditional figure of Herod in the Bethlehem plays, when he makes Bottom talk of playing a tyrant. 100 years before, he might have found such things in 100 Hamlets. Here again the Renaissance, the renewal of social life, must begin at the other end. We are not really making fresh things. We are merely extending and repeating stale things to fresh people, who do not long remain fresh under the experience. We are merely making even a joke mechanical and therefore melancholy. It is as unnatural to pay men to joke as to pay men to laugh. The real refreshment can only come by a return to liberty or the life of the private person. As with the games, we are merely making new formalities out of old frivolities. We are not having the real fun of making new frivolities out of old formalities. And having touched on the example of hide and seek, hockey, and the movies, I will pass on to lighter topics like politics. End of section 2.
Section 3 of G.K. Chesterton in Vanity Fair magazine. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. G.K. Chesterton in Vanity Fair magazine by G.K. Chesterton. Section 3. Public Laws and Private Liquors. The most startling and rending revolution in our politics would be the introduction of self-government. We are perhaps further from it than any human beings in history. We may have parliamentary government or republican government. We may even, with far less truth, call it democratic government. If we mean that the mob of the city is occasionally consulted, preferably about something it cannot possibly understand. We may help to decide the destiny of Yugoslavs or Czechoslovaks. It is our own destiny we cannot decide. Governing ourselves would mean governing our own furniture, architecture, and landscape, and what we eat and drink and wear. Whatever else we have not got this. I will take a familiar, if fanciful case, like the case of games, of how our novelty never begins at home. Our fathers, or rather our mothers, made drinks from all kinds of plants and fruits, as monasteries made their own liquors. If life had developed along that line more luxuriantly, we should go to dine with Brown or Robinson, not to drink the same champagne or cognac, but a curious liquor called brownie, or a special vintage of Chateau Robinson. It might be something extracted from hollyhocks, or a trifle distilled from sunflowers. It might be an acquired taste, but it would be a true novelty and not as the advertisements. But the important point here is simply this, that any such invention would be instantly crushed by all our modern laws about licensing, distilling, alcohol, and all the rest of it. That is how freedom and self-government can be crushed today. Brown can never discover brownie. Seasons return, but not to us returns the sacred day in religious history when the Benedictines discovered Benedictine. It may certainly be maintained, as reformers do maintain, that drinking is a public matter, but only on the theory that there is no such thing as a private matter. If a man does not own his own body, he cannot possibly own anything, least of all his own soul. He cannot claim to clothe his body unless he can claim to feed it. For the outer world cannot have more rights over his inside than his outside. Or again, if he cannot open his mouth to drink, he cannot open it to talk. A reformer, rather wiser perhaps than most of our social reformers, said, it may be remembered by the learned, nearly 2,000 years ago, that what cometh out of the mouth, and not what goeth in, defileth a man. A great deal of harm is done through drinking, but a mathematician might well go mad in trying to calculate the amount of harm that is done by talking. As many homes have been wrecked by nagging as by drinking, and the drinking has very often been the result of the nagging. The most irresistible and the most irrevocable part of education has been done before the beginning of instruction. It is not in what is said to a child, but in what is said before a child. More than half of our psychology is probably an accumulation of accidents. Our brains were built up of idle words, and we found our first principles in things we were not meant to hear. In short, if the reformer rests his case on the largeness of the problem, we know that there is nothing so large as small talk. We all know that, as the saint said, the tongue is little and terrible, that a snub may make men hopeless, but a compliment may make them vain, that we all walk the world dealing this destruction out of our mouths. We have all had the feeling that parents bring up their children in the right way by systematically saying the wrong thing. Or at least, if parents will not admit this about themselves, they will admit it about each other. But picture the horrible pantomime that life would be if we made a public rule for this private matter, as we are now making it for the other private matter. Suppose the state interfered with speech as it now interferes with drink, with diet, and details of hygiene. Suppose there were a conversation ministry as there is a health ministry in England today. Suppose the state sent out armies of eavesdroppers to hide behind doors and under tables, as it now sends out armies of inspectors to measure windows or analyze water. Suppose doctors were allowed to cut off the tongues of poor children whom they chose to call vicious, as they are allowed to cut off the hair of poor children whom they choose to call verminous. Suppose talk were treated as drink is treated in England. Suppose a man was not allowed to tell a funny story except between 1 and 2 or between 6 and 9. Or suppose he had to get a doctor's prescription to allow him to laugh, a little scientific essay saying that the exercise was not beyond his muscular powers and was necessary to his nervous system. Suppose talk was treated as drink is treated in America. Suppose there was, as the romances say, an utter universal silence, broken only by those who could manage to break it. Suppose a man who wanted to laugh was allowed to go to somebody who sold snuff on the pretense that he wanted to sneeze. Suppose he had to go into a sort of loft full of luggage and put his head in a bag. Or suppose a trickle of talk were permitted, so long as it had passed, like the water, through the filter of the scientific state. A man might take out a license, allowing him so many words a week, with a fine for slang words and a bonus for scientific words. Or we might have our conversation for the day planned out for us by intelligent officials. On sitting down to dinner, we might find a little card, like a menu, providing us with 14 platitudes and 2 epigrams. All the world would be a stage, and all the men and women merely players. Word perfect in their respective parts in one prearranged social comedy, written for his own entertainment by some salaried gentleman at Washington or Whitehall. Now, the purpose of the comparison is entirely concrete and conclusive, though there may seem at first a faint tinge of the fanciful or the improbable about these examples of it. The point is that if we found ourselves murmuring gently against such a state stricture on talk, our complaint would not consist of denying either its public importance or its possible utility. If there were no talk, there would be far fewer tragedies, and Maeterlinck might argue that, in a universal silence, all souls would begin to understand each other. It is certain that many souls would be less likely to misunderstand each other to the extent of murder and suicide. Our objection could not be stated in the form that the restriction did us no good of any kind. It could be rather stated in the form that it left us no good of our own. It would serve to cut down to almost nothing the effect of our own personalities on our own lives. And that is precisely the tendency of the whole political machinery of our time. It means our being linked up with 1,000 things that are not our own, and thereby losing everything that is our own. We are to receive good things, but we are not to choose good things, far less to create good things. A man is to be a market that is all imports and no exports. The city is trying to build citizens, forgetting that only the citizens can build the city. The sort of citizen it is trying to build is what one might expect it to be if brainless bricks and mortar tried to imagine a man. But the citizen is not only practically prevented from building a city, but even from building a house. The shape even of the shell that he should make for himself is beaten shapeless by all sorts of heavy hygienic and bureaucratic limitations. Now I suggest, as a convenient parable, that a city would be much more interesting if every house in it were made by a man and not by a machine. To give the parable more local color, I will fit it to a concrete case in the countryside where I live. The poor for miles round my house have long been needlessly impoverished by being forbidden to keep pigs. The form of the veto is that the pigsty must be at a certain distance from the house, and its aim is supposed to be hygienic. The fact of it is that the pig owner must be rich enough to own a fair amount of land, and its aim is the prevention of small property, otherwise the oppression of the poor. Now, compared with this state of things, I would unhesitatingly prefer that a pig were curled up on the drawing-room hearthrug like a cat, or taken out for a drive in a motor car like a lapdog. I would prefer that my next-door neighbor should keep not merely a pet pig, but a pet kangaroo, or even a pet rhinoceros. I would rather he planned his whole house to suit the rhinoceros, a regal rhinoceros style eclipsing the glories of a pigsty. I would rather that a wild rhinocerine style of architecture ran through every pillar and pinnacle of that habitation, its walls heavy with pachyderotomatous plates, its spires rising into horrible horns. For if this be a nightmare, even to the fastidious nonsense, at least it would mean that a man was alive somewhere and doing what he liked with something. And that would be better than this modern centralization, in which a city is a cemetery. It is a cemetery of whited sepulchres, in which one funeral official goes his round with a pail of whitewash, and we sit silent in our houses because we are dead. End of Section 3, Public Laws and Private Liquors. Read by Michael Shane Craig Lambert, L.C. Section 4 of G.K. Chesterton in Vanity Fair magazine. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. G.K. Chesterton in Vanity Fair magazine by G.K. Chesterton. Section 4, Beauty and the Bricklayer. I once compared a row of our modern houses to a row of tombstones in an old and decayed cemetery. But this, I must confess, was rather too cheery and optimistic a view of our society. For as it happens, an old churchyard is one particular place where you can still find that indescribable element of liberty and even levity. You can find it in an old churchyard when you certainly cannot find it in a new suburb. It is summed up in the single fact that, once upon a time, men wrote their own epitaphs. What they wrote was generally doggerel. It was sometimes drivel. It was occasionally, in brighter intervals, blasphemy. But it was something that man had really done himself, and gave him a right to his own tombstone, like the right of a poet to his poem. You will not often find 3 or 4 doctors' brass plates in the same suburban street, ornamented with flourishes so personal or so playful. You will not always persuade city men to write short lyrics on their visiting cards, as these rustics would write short poems on their headstones. It is in face of such things that we are tempted to say that our fathers were more festive at a funeral than we are at a wedding, and that they are livelier dead than we are alive. But there is another way in which this chance image is applicable to our position in politics, and even more in economics. These old tombstones were often, as Gray has put it, with shapeless sculpture decked, that is, carved with some rude religious symbol. The more hopeful generally displayed a rather bloated cherub. The less hilarious were satisfied with the skull. The point is, for the present, that the thing is at least an emblem of something. Now, to recur to our pleasing, nay, flattering comparison of a modern gentleman's front door to his grave, we may note that the door also will often display an ornament. Only it is an ornament, but not an emblem. Mr. Smith's knocker. The door knocker, for instance, is sometimes molded into a face. It might be a cherub like the other. It is quite likely to be a lion or a dragon or other frowning or grinning animal. But it does not mean anything, and certainly not anything in any way connected with a front door. The frown does not mean privacy. The grin does not mean hospitality. The head of the lion does not mean that Mr. Smith inside is heroic and magnanimous. Still less does the head of the dragon mean that he is dangerous and savage. And this truth will grow the more steadily upon us if we examine the other houses in the sort of London street of which I am thinking, and note the curious fact that each householder is symbolized by the same image, a lion or dragon as the case may be. Mr. Smith is not specially likely to have a knocker in the convenient shape of a hammer, the natural ensign of the great guild of the Smiths, any more than Mr. Brown next door is likely to have his front door painted brown in proud allusion to his surname. In a word, it is generally true that modern ornaments are meaningless ornaments. The thing on the old tombstone may be a very grotesque suggestion of a cherub, and a cherub may be a very grotesque suggestion of a spirit in heaven. But at least it is meant for something, and for something that means something. If we do not like it, we had better carve something that means something else, but not hang ugly faces in front of our houses, faces that are meant for nobody and made the same for everybody. Labor and the tombstone. Now, in this rude example, properly understood, can be found the whole problem which is today the most terrible part of politics, which, in a sense, is far more political than any politics. In this, I mean, can be found the fundamental psychology of the great problem of labor, in the sense in which it is controversially opposed to capital. Our politics ignore the true idea of liberty, and it is here that they tend more and more to ignore the true ideas of equality and fraternity. The first case dealt with things like the house a man lives in, or the liquor that he drinks, and it suggested that he is not self-government in his leisure. The second case deals with things like the trade a man works at or the tools he works with, and suggests that he is not self-government in his labor. The image I have used of one of the long suburban streets outside London, with door and door knockers all the same, will serve very well to illustrate both sides of the case. The clerk who is put in one of those houses has no practical control over what the house is like, but the bricklayer who puts him in has quite as little. The bricklayer is expected to lay bricks as the hen is expected to lay eggs, with quite as little conscious control over the artistic shape he produces. The householder has no influence on the look of his own knocker, but even the man whose whole purpose in life it is to provide knockers has quite as little. And we live in a time when there is some danger of the bricklayer throwing bricks instead of laying them, and a younger generation, as it says in Ibsen's play, may be knocking at the doors with something other than a knocker. Oddly enough, the very name of Ibsen's play is to the point here. The point is that the householder is not the builder. The bricklayer is not the builder, and even the builder is not the master builder. The very phrase master builder, like the phrase masterpiece, is a memory of the age of guilds. Now, everybody knows that medieval craftsmanship permitted a considerable play of personality, even in the lower grades of the work. So far from mechanically following any orders, even those of the person employing him to build or carve, the craftsman would sometimes fill his work with practical jokes against his patron, just as if he had fitted and furnished his patron's house entirely with booby traps and butter slides. Thus, the miserere seats, on which the priests sat, are often carved all over with anti-clerical caricatures, representing priests in ridiculous postures. There again, by the way, is an odd significance in a name. Jokes more broadly comic than Pickwick can be found in the place called Miserere, which sounds to many like a cry of misery, and is really a cry for mercy. I think there is a moral, but it is not the moral relevant here. The interested paperhanger. It is a fashionable complaint that the modern working man takes no interest in his work, that he does not show initiative or take responsibility. It is largely just to say that he does not. But it will also be just to realize that we should be much more indignant if he did. We should be much more staggered if he began to show an intelligent interest in the doorknocker, as the medieval workman showed an intelligent interest in the miserere seat. The householder would be surprised, nay pained, if on returning to his home at evening, he found the doorknocker twisted into an animated but unattractive likeness of himself, possibly decorated with the ears of a donkey or terminating in the tail of a devil. Nor would his doubts pass away if he went on and found that the bricklayer had molded each of the bricks into a different fantastic variation of the same familiar face, or if the painter or paperhanger had covered the walls with a pattern of small figures, representing the patron running, falling, sitting on his hat, tumbling out of his car, and so on. This would be a fair modern parallel to the medieval anti-clerical carvings, and this would certainly be a case of the workman being really interested in his work, nay, of his being interested in his patron. The modern world, with all of its talk of innovation, does not really allow for novelty. It does not provide for what a man shall do if he really has a new notion. When he is tied by modern mechanism either to the same old business or merely to the same old game. The clay in which the old craftsman worked was more flexible, and could receive the imprint of passing personal fancies without disorganizing the whole of the larger design. A man could carve his own gargoyle without wrecking everybody else's cathedral. Today, it is not merely the fact that building banks or business houses is far less noble than building cathedrals. It is also that, in these new heathen cathedrals, all pleasure is for the architect and not for the craftsman, all design for the banker and not for the bank clerks. It is only the heads of business who can really use their heads. The others are truly described as hands. The millionaire may make fancy combinations of his millions, but the clerk who makes fancy combinations of the figures in a ledger is not encouraged. This is the real proletarian problem, and it is much more than an economic one. The worst injustice is not the inequality of wealth, but the inequality of intelligent interest. The new Renaissance must not merely redistribute wages for work, it must renew the work itself. It must renew it where all work begins, with the head and hands of a man. For the rising generation is, in a nobler sense, knocking at the door. It is not merely breaking into the house like a housebreaker, but hammering out a new door like a master builder. End of Section 4, Beauty and the Bricklayer. Read by Michael Shane Craig Lambert, L.C. Section 5 of G.K. Chesterton in Vanity Fair magazine. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. G.K. Chesterton in Vanity Fair magazine by G.K. Chesterton. Section 5. The Library Broken Loose. Cosmopolitanism consists in saying that because the English like tea and the French like coffee, therefore a mixture of coffee and tea will be an universal beverage, pleasing the palates of all nations. This unity, which I detest more than all the other devils tempting the modern mind, is all the more a devil because it dresses up in the vestments of various religions, new in the West or old in the East, or both. But there is another form of fallacy which is even more impudent than this notion of a mere mixture, as anything more than a mere muddle. There is the reformer who does not even mix anything because he has nothing to mix. He may be rather compared to a man who should boast of having discovered a new and admirable wine, dating its vintage and praising its bouquet, when he only means that he wants us to drink water. More often he means that he wants us to drink nothing at all. The flavor of mingled tea and coffee, though not necessarily pleasurable, would probably be perceptible. But the other reformer invites us with boisterous hospitality to drink out of an empty cup. He is especially prominent in the province of the arts, notably of literature. And the mark of him is that he offers a thing as new when it is merely negative. Let us take, for the sake of argument, the case of poetry. A man who could really invent a new meter would indeed be like a man who could invent a new wine or a new game. He would have made a fresh tune for all men to think to. Even a man who should succeed in introducing a genuine modification or new management of an old meter would almost be worthy of a statue, if not of a shrine. A real change passed over poetry even with the arrangement of the 4 lines in Memoriam, or of the other 4 lines in the great English translation of Omar, where Fitzgerald was more dismal about wine than Tennyson about death. For that matter, there has lately been no new lyrical form in the formal manner of the old ballads or villanelles, whose limitations can be very fruitful. Anybody can write a triolet, but nobody can invent a triolet, in the sense of something of the type of a triolet. A friend of mine did indeed invent a form of 5 lines of intricate rhyme and haunting rhythm, but he found that only one set of words could possibly be made to fit it, and they did not make anything very striking in the way of sense. So he retired in despair, and wrote the best detective story of the century. Still, it certainly was a new meter, and a new meter would be something new. But the fashionable idea of innovation is to have no meter. It must be exceedingly easy to innovate in that style. It suggests obvious possibilities in the new cookery, which consists of eating things raw, or the new cut and fashion in clothes, which is walking about naked, or the new and original school of architecture, which involves sleeping in the open air. But there is no discovery here, because there is no enrichment. This is not adding something, but only taking something away. I think Walt Whitman was a very great man, but I think he would have been a greater one if he had written in meter. It seems chiefly a matter of the arrangement of words on a page, and I prefer the affectation of the old Cavalier rhymers, who wrote their verses in the shape of a dove or a heart. For these were at least shapes, and not shapelessness. But the other is entirely negative. It seems to consist not in arranging poetry, but in disarranging prose. But the same trick of substituting negation for novelty can be seen in more subtle and generally more soothing manifestations in many other branches of modern art, and notably in that very fashionable narrative art which we call fiction. Just now, the novel is anything but novel. In theory, it should be a new form, since it arose later in human history than the drama, the epic, the lyric, and the other recognized forms. It is now not so much a new form as a new formlessness, or something that is daily growing more formless and less new. It is not a new shape, like a new box or bag made to contain certain things. It is more like an old sack so loose and shapeless that the things of any shape can be stuffed into it. If the novelist has a fancy for explaining at length why he himself does not believe in tariffs or conditional immortality, if he wishes to describe in detail a village he once visited in Sweden, or to refute the arguments of a book on the higher criticism that has recently irritated him, or to write a lampoon on his publisher, or to introduce a happy phrase he has thought of to describe the earlier stages of seasickness, he puts all of this as a matter of course into the novel he happens to be writing at the time. There is nothing to stop him. There are no rules to test whether a thing is novel or not, for the novel arose historically in a romantic reaction from all rules. A lyric means a thing that can be sung. A drama means a thing that can be acted. But a novel need not mean anything, not even a thing that can be read. It can be written, and even that is a mystery. Thus it is broadly true of books, and even of pictures and statues as well as books, that the only idea of innovation is the destruction of limits, or as I should say, of outlines. A novel is only new insofar that we are not quite sure whether it is a diary or a dictionary or a bundle of pamphlets or the notes of a psychologist or the daydreams of a landscape painter. A vast amount of very beautiful work is being done in this way. But such a mere negative escape is not a renaissance in literature. It would have much more the note of a renaissance if we heard of new limits and new laws. Men mock at the old unities of the classical drama, but it would be far more really revolutionary if we heard of new unities for the contemporary novel. Then we should know that some kind of creative impulse was carving new forms out of the chaos of formless fiction. For when anything from a boys' club to a new republic is really free, it uses its liberty to make laws. And one of the first laws that both the club and the republic generally have an impulse to make is a law for the limitation of speeches. It may be observed that those who cannot speak at all generally speak for a long time. In other words, those who make bad speeches generally make interminable speeches, because they cannot stop. And that is what is the matter with all the arts of self-expression when art is for a time in decline. They cannot stop. The sonnet becomes an epic without knowing it. The short story becomes a long story out of sheer absence of mind. The drama deadens into a daily routine because the actors, like those in Sheridan's play, do not know how to get off the stage. The parallels of intellectual architecture elongate themselves in the endless perspectives of a nightmare. And when the dreamers have done the same thing for the 1000th time and forgotten how they came to do it, they say they are doing something new. End of Section 5, The Library Broken Loose. Read by Michael Shane Craig Lambert, L.C. Section 6 of G.K. Chesterton in Vanity Fair magazine. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. G.K. Chesterton in Vanity Fair magazine by G.K. Chesterton. Section 6. Nothing and the New Religions. These loose papers are strung together by a thread of theory, touching the possibility of a renaissance in the sense of a renewal of our civilization. Hitherto, I have given only a few notes on the negative side, suggesting that there is no such real freshness in our recent fashions about sport, politics, the drama, and so on. Not one of these is a beginning, but rather a sort of endless end. In what follows, I hope to give a rough sketch of the way in which a renaissance might really begin. But I will pause here, partly to recapitulate and sum up, and partly to point out a possible mistake and answer an obvious criticism. Anyone urging this view is bound to look back at other beginnings in history. He is bound to urge that anything really original will resemble the origins. But he is not trying to revive such origins, but only such originality. I suggest that a new development is not often a new discovery, any more than any number of horses added to a stagecoach would make it a steam engine. I may say, in such a case, that the man who first caught and tamed a horse invented something far in advance of most of our inventions. But I do not mean that I want all publicists and politicians to start off by trying to lasso wild horses. The medieval workman. Thus, in the cases already considered, I have expressed admiration for many antiquities, but I was not admiring their antiquity, but their novelty. I remarked that cricket began with stool ball, and that stool ball began with stools. But I do not mean that man is to find his way back to that particular wooden stool of medieval workmanship, and sit there forever, so to speak, on the stool of repentance. I mean that medieval men were in a certain spirit, in which something could be done with a stool, and that if we were in that spirit, we could do as much or more with a stick or a stone or anything else. In the case of the drama, I said that the workmen who acted in the Coventry Mysteries and were genially satirized as acting in The Midsummer Night's Dream were at least amateur actors in the good as well as the bad sense. That is, they were amateurs in the literal sense of lovers. A workman, as for instance a weaver, could condole in some measure and appear as a lover, though his chief humor was for a tyrant. But I do not mean that we ought to train an actor to appear in the character of a wall, or even that it is necessary for a modern comedian to create the part of moonshine. I do not even think, as do some of our more mystical Shakespeareans, that it is necessary to reproduce the restricted scenery or shallow stage of the Shakespearean period. I do not see why poor Bottom, having a part to tear a cat in, should not have room to swing a cat in. In those restrictions of space, I fancy, there is rather too much wall and perhaps not a little moonshine. But I mean that certain moral conditions enabled those simple men to enjoy themselves, and that with similar moral conditions, we might enjoy ourselves as much, or even more. The principle is the same in the domestic and dietetic criticisms I suggested, which were summed up by saying that our citizenship does not really allow us any self-government. I took the illustration that our grandmothers made cowslip wine, but it does not follow that our grandsons must know how to make cowslip wine, still less how to drink it. I may entertain my fancy with the thought of wild poets extracting wine from wild flowers, or daring adventurers drinking from that dreadful cup, as for instance the buttercup. But this is not the point of the argument. The point is that the old family recipes were, so far as they went, real domestic discoveries. They varied with domestic establishments, and one dandelion tea differed from another in glory. It would not be a substitute, even if it were an improvement, that the political power of the brewers should doom us all to drink one kind of beer. Still less is it a substitute that the political power of teetotalers should doom us all to drink no kind of beer. And I went on to note that in other things this mere negation is mistaken for novelty. Thus a poet is as proud of having no meter as if he had invented a new meter. Here again I could only illustrate my meaning from old meters, and I praise those fixed yet fantastic forms of verse, the ballad, the villanelle, the triolet, such as took form in the Middle Ages and the Renaissance, and the real springtimes of Europe. But I do not mean that the future epic of the Great War must be written in a series of triolets, or that the national anthem of one of the new democracies should take the exact form of a villanelle. I only mean that we should follow our fathers insofar as they showed their vigor by inventing new forms, and not merely by relapsing into old formlessness. Modern, merely destructive fashions have a great deal to learn from these constructive old fashions, if it were only the construction of a sonnet. It may be very absurd for the Elizabethan lover to write a sonnet to his mistress's eyebrow, but it would not be an improvement if the lady, having already bobbed her hair, were to shave off her eyebrows. And that is the drift of the destructive fashions, towards some such darkened world of women without eyebrows and men without eyes. New religions and the old mysteries. In short, while I heartily agree that so large and loose a criticism has 100 faults, I shall not be at all disturbed by the very old reproach of returning to what is old. First of all, it need not necessarily be a bad thing to do. And secondly, I know I am not doing it. I am not returning to what has grown old, but rather to what cannot grow old. That thing is a certain spirit, of which the terms are to be found rather in philosophy or religion. And I will conclude this negative part of my criticism by briefly noting that in this sphere also my generalization seems to hold good. There appear to be quite a number of new religions nowadays, and there really are, in the sense that 1,000 theories now assume the supernatural and dismiss the merely materialistic. The new religions have plenty of new miracles, but they only have very old mysteries. Mysteries so old as to be obvious, and so obvious as not to be mysterious. The new religions mostly preach a unity in which even their own differentiation would disappear. Perhaps I might delicately hint that dullness seems to be the chief artistic feature of new religions. It is enough here to note that no new religion does dare to do the concrete and, as some would say, comic things done by old mysticism and mythology. Nobody points at an old hat and says it fell from heaven, or a particular lamppost as the solitary light of the world. Still less does he ring the hat with a golden halo, or even hang it on a golden hat peg. Nor does he build his city round the lamppost as he would round the shrine. But this concrete, creative superstition, expressed in color and ornament, is a very real indication of something new and sincere. There would be more real simplicity in spiritualism if the tables on which the spirits rap were carved and inlaid like altars, or the planchettes gilded and colored like chalices. What is stale about spiritualism is its pretense of being scientific, a very early Victorian affectation. So of Christian Science. Mr. Zangwill said in his pointed and effective fashion that it is science without severity and Christianity without its cross. But if Mrs. Eddy's book is not as severe as science, it must be conceded that it is quite as dry as science. And this featureless and uncreative dullness, as compared with the creeds that made the Greek temples or the Gothic cathedrals, is all that concerns me here. Tennyson and the Gleam. I am not touching on the truth of these two new religions, or pretending that such a passing comment can do justice to them in all aspects. I merely observe that they do, in their different ways, fall in with the fashion of dissolving solid things rather than renewing solid things. They are part of a modern tendency much older than themselves to make the vision of man vague rather than vivid. I have always felt it in one of the phrases of Tennyson, which seems to me one of the modern mistakes of Tennyson. Instead of making Merlin talk of following the Grail, he makes him talk of following the gleam. I doubt whether Merlin, in the Tennyson sense at least, would ever have followed the gleam. The Grail may be a fairy tale, but it is a tale. It can be told again and again with 1,000 enrichments and renewals. It may be a fabulous cup, but it is a cup. It can be carved and painted and pictured in 1,000 picturesque associations. But a gleam might be anything or nothing. And I seriously think a man must often pluck first, not only the beam, but the gleam out of his own eye, before he can see the Grail. End of section 6. Nothing and the New Religions. Read by Michael Shane Craig Lambert, L.C.
Section 7 of G.K. Chesterton in Vanity Fair magazine. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Kate Follis. G.K. Chesterton in Vanity Fair magazine by G.K. Chesterton. The Soul of Skylarking. Thoughts on the New Renaissance and the Structure of the Future by G.K. Chesterton. Something is necessary before we can really learn to enjoy games, or to enjoy theaters, or to enjoy things of art or invention, and that is that we should learn to enjoy enjoyment. It is this faculty that is always slipping away from men, and it slips away faster and faster in the modern mood of always looking for the latest thing. It matters nothing whether this takes a reactionary or a revolutionary form. It matters nothing whether it is a snobbish pursuit of the latest fashions, and is called capitalism, or a priggish pursuit of the latest fads, and is called socialism. It is equally true that the hurry after happiness is itself unhappy, and that a man is learning how to find enjoyments, and not how to enjoy. But commonly the two things are combined, for the rich, especially the wicked rich, are very progressive. Progress is another name for going the pace. It is among the wicked rich that you will find the advanced art, the portraits without faces, the statues without figures, and the poems without poetry. Now, any real renewal must be based more broadly on much more simple and popular things. When I say simple things, I do not mean things like the simple life. Vegetarianism or teetotalism are obviously the very reverse of simple. I should not call a man simple if he could only eat pink things or pale yellow things, nor do I call him simple if he can only eat green things. I call him fastidious and even luxurious. I should not consider a child beautifully childlike, who, when offered a glass of milk, asked whether it contained any allotropic forms of alkaloid, or what not. Nor do I consider a man childlike, who, when offered a glass of beer, asks whether it contains any alcohol, another arbitrary abstraction conjectured by a few chemists. I mean by a simple man or child, a good and sensible man or child, and I mean that a sensible child takes what he can get, and a simple man is one who can enjoy the normal and national food and drink. I do not say he should always enjoy them, or that he should not enjoy other things. I say he should be able to enjoy the normal things, and not be reduced by successive and rapid reforms into a condition in which he cannot enjoy anything whatever. Bad books and bad beer. Thus it is said, for instance, that the public likes bad books. But in England, at any rate, if it likes bad books, it is very much as it drinks bad beer. It does so because it cannot get any good beer, and has to choose between bad beer and something that is not beer at all. So the ordinary reader often has to choose between bad books and things like those which Charles Lamb called books that are not books. He has to choose between a bald and badly written story about love and murder, and a story that is not a story at all, but a medical diary describing the more minute sensations of an incipient lunatic, or the pros and cons of erecting a tin chapel for some new religion. The more refined artists have been driven to this, not so much because they are so lucky as to find nerves and new religion interesting, as because they are so lamentably unlucky as to find love and murder uninteresting. They have lost their normal power of enjoying enjoyable things, such as murder and love-making. The very novelty of their art is the fatigue of their minds. The artists are trying to enjoy fresh things with a stale mind, while the public is still enjoying stale things with a fresh mind. That fresh mind is the first need of a fresh society. It is more convenient to take a concrete case, and I will take the case of poetry, especially the poetry of nature. It is an old joke that papers and the public are tormented by a swarm of spring poets who come out like the birds in spring. It is an old joke that the editor receives 1,000,000 original odes to the skylark and generally prints the worst of them. But even if the spring poetry is worthless, the spring is not worthless. Like death and first love and the other materials of the detective story and the novelette, it is a marvel none the less real for being recurrent. In short, the little poet, like the large public, may not be occupied with great works, but he is occupied with great things. It may be tiresome to listen to the poet on the skylark, but it is not tiresome to listen to the skylark. At least it ought not to be, but it is the whole problem of the new and fastidious artist that it is. The skylark and the flamingo. He is tired, not of the small achievements, but of the great subjects of poetry. Probably he has heard too many odes to the skylark, and too few skylarks. Anyhow, he is in a mood to kill the skylark, as the sailor did the albatross, and to run after some more rare bird, let us say the flamingo. The vivid color and fantastic form of that wild fowl would have fitted it well for the decorative poems of the decadence, where down the purple corridors the screaming scarlet ibis flew. I do not object to such screaming, even to such screaming colors. There is a poetry in the ibis and the flamingo, as well as in the skylark. The only creature without any poetry is the poet, who is tired of the skylark. What is the matter with him is that he has sought out a new screaming scarlet sort of skylark, not because his senses are keen, but because they are jaded. The bird has to be screaming because he is nearly deaf, and scarlet because he is nearly blind. Moreover, the necessity of substituting the flamingo for the skylark involves the advanced and fastidious bird fancier in other difficulties. Perhaps the poet finds that there are not many rhymes to flamingo, and that jingo and lingo are alien to the mood and atmosphere. Therefore he decides that rhyme is a jingling fetter unworthy of free modern verse, or he finds the meter is disturbed by the insinuation of a flamingo instead of a lark, as it would be if he had to scan the line, "Hark, hark, the flamingo at heaven's gate sings," or as who should say, "Like to the flamingo at break of day, arising from sullen earth sings hymns at heaven's gate." And finding this to run a little awkwardly, he naturally decides that meter as well as rhyme is a meaningless convention, and that the modern spirit can only express itself in verse libre. Only the poet happens to be wrong, according to the whole history of poetry. The editor may receive 1,000,000 poems by minor poets about the skylark, but anywhere among them there may be one signed William Shakespeare, and another signed William Wordsworth, and another signed Percy Bysshe Shelley, whereas it might be difficult to compile a golden treasury entirely about the flamingo. It is the common subjects, not the uncommon subjects, on which the rare masterpieces of poetry have been written. It was because the major poets shared the enthusiasm of the minor poets. It was because they dealt with terms and things in the very texture of popular thought and speech. For instance, the same images are to be found not only in song, but even in slang. The very case of the skylark has a prose parallel to the expression skylarking, presupposing a verb to skylark. It would be interesting if there were a verb to flamingo, presumably conjugated like the verb to go. It would be almost alarming if we said not only "I flamingo," but "thou hast flamingon," not to mention so extreme a case as "he flamin went." This may seem to the fastidious almost to verge on the fanciful, but this is a fair parallel to the verb skylarking, which is a perfect fragment of popular poetry to express a wild and hilarious holiday. But a man cannot have a popular holiday all by himself, and a man cannot create a new language all by himself. He cannot even paint the town red without the consent of the townsfolk, even if he can disregard the town council. And that very metaphor brings us to the practical outcome of this primary truth. Given due and proper occasion, I have no particular objection to his painting the town as red as the flamingo, but even if he does so with the applause of all his neighbors, he will probably find that pleasing the town council is very different from pleasing the town. In short, he will come face to face with the falsity of modern politics, which has next to be considered. Poets and politicians. I said that our basis must be simple and popular, and that I did not mean by simple the puritanical pose of the simple life. I may add that I do not mean by popular the plutocratic corruption of the representative system. The machinery labeled democracy is not a popular thing. Indeed, the very word democracy is not a popular word. How many times a day does a shoe black or a scavenger use the word democracy? Yet it is on words he does use and ideas he does understand that we must found a really popular commonwealth. Such a society must do what poets do for the people, and what politicians never by any chance do for the people. It must give them what they themselves desire, but cannot always devise. One poet writes love songs for 100 lovers. One romancer writes adventure stories for 100 boys who would like to have adventures. The new statesman must do the right thing, which we desire to have done, but cannot do. The modern politician does the wrong thing, and then adds insult to injury and falsehood to folly by telling us we have done it ourselves. End of section 7.
Section 8 of G.K. Chesterton in Vanity Fair magazine. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. G.K. Chesterton in Vanity Fair magazine by G.K. Chesterton. Section 8. The Sleepwalker and the State. In stirring up stupid people, it is a common taunt to tell them they are asleep. Though one feels that the taunt would hardly be really telling if it turned out to be really true. It would be disconcerting to utter such a sneer and be only answered by a snore. But in a more spiritual sense, slumber has always been the symbol of sloth and ignorance, and it is therefore particularly applicable to our age of industry and education. But the particularity of people today is that they are not only sleeping, but sleepwalking. The dullness and bewilderment symbolized by sleep have more than once in the course of history thus settled on the mind of humanity. People went to sleep at the end of the Roman Empire till somewhere about the time of the Great Awakening of the Crusades. But in the sleep of the Dark Ages, there were at least glorious dreams. The Holy Grail and the Horn of Roland were the visions that shone in that night. They made the mental life continuous, so that on waking, men took up the same work and worship and memory that they had when they fell asleep. People went to sleep a good deal at the end of the 17th century. The sermons of the great reforming divines and the speeches of the great constitutional statesmen were enough to achieve that healthful result. That went on till the great awakening of the French Revolution. But if people by that time were bored with their religion, they were free from any grave fear of finding any other. The peculiarity of our time is that we still have a vague idea that we are soon going to find something. Not something we had before, but something so new that we not only cannot remember it, but could hardly even recognize it. As the Dark Ages went to sleep with their Catholicism, and the later period went to sleep with its Calvinism, we went to sleep with our minds full of the modern idea of progress. Hope is to us what faith was to our fathers. Our ultimate hold is not on something we have got, but on something we are going to get. Only we have forgotten what it is. Sleep has knocked us silly at a moment when we were marching somewhere, or were supposed to be marching somewhere. Nobody now has the least notion where. There is nothing but a notion that we must keep moving, like the modern poor moved on by the modern police. We are a society of somnambulists. 80 years ago, men did know more or less where they were going, or at least where they wanted to go. At any rate, the leaders of the processions knew or professed to know. They believed that freedom, especially in the form of free trade, would solve everything, that commercial competition would have all the success of something they called, poor old chaps, the survival of the fittest. They preached that we should always pick up the cheapest bishop, that the army would be best ruled if all the generals fought each other, and that the breed of admirals would improve if everybody paddled his own canoe. In short, they had a lucid and logical philosophy which suddenly collapsed and disappeared. They accepted the competitive creed of letting the devil take the hindmost. When a flash of more rational moral theology revealed the fact that he is much more likely to catch the foremost. It revealed the fact that millionaires are not the best and wisest, but the worst and stupidest men of our time. Then there was a change. 20 years ago, again, the leaders at least thought they knew where they wanted to go, or at least in what direction. Needless to say, it was the opposite direction. They not only forbade a man to paddle his own canoe, but almost to wear his own coat and trousers. They had a sort of vague vision of a communal pair of trousers, made with any number of legs like the costume of an octopus. The Fabians, led on by the fantastic genius of Shaw, suggested that the state could adequately clean and control everything. Idealists could imagine state toothbrushes and state toothpicks. All would be well if government would only govern, and at the same time educate and inspect. The somnambulist went very happily upon this higher path, till he woke up with a shriek on the brink of a precipice, the name of which was Prussia. The new somnambulism. Escaping from Prussia, however, has exhausted him, and he has gone to sleep again rather more deeply than before. But though he is again sleeping, he is still walking. He is not walking anywhere now. He is just walking. He does not hold what he has got till he can really think of something better, as did the common sense of the Dark Ages. He picks theories up and throws them away, as a listless man picks up pebbles and throws them into the sea. He has no faith but fashion. He has no test, except the last thing said is the first thing to be considered. He will allow his children to be taken out of his house, his glass to be knocked out of his hand. For he has no ideal standard, no goal which is to him what the golden age of peace and commerce was to his grandfather, or the utopia of William Morris was to his father. He does not know whether he wants to be more individualistic or less, more communist or less, but he cannot stop as he is until he has found out. The one thing he has been taught to believe in is change. He has to move on like the wandering Jew, and that is why the wandering Jews have so much influence on him. Now, if we go on destroying things in a dream, we shall soon come to the end of them, but the only way of preventing it is to begin again. It is to go back to very simple things, as I said in my last article, and to ask what simple people really do want. Now, the first thing to realize is that they never did really want any of these large social schemes. They wanted something else, which was promised by these schemes. But that something itself was very simple. It may not be a simple thing to do, but it is a perfectly simple thing to desire. The large social schemes, capitalist or collectivist, are not simple and are not desired in any democratic sense. This is obvious from the very language in which they are expressed, a language perfectly unintelligible to most plain people anywhere. I read an article recently by an American socialist who ended like a man giving a toast or shouting a war cry. "Long live the United International Proletarian Social Democratic Republic." But imagine anybody shouting that in a battle. One has a feeling that the war would be finished before the war cry. Imagine a howling mob with one voice carefully articulating all those separate polysyllables. It is as if a man uttered the post office regulations in a moment of passion, or ejaculated an encyclopedia as a sort of oath. Of course, there is the same cant on the capitalist side. Journalists will talk of the state discouraging individual enterprise, as if modern enterprises were particularly individual. As if a man chose freely between the gay and witty vivacity of the Amalgamated Anglo-American Rubber Company and the more mellow and melancholy sense of humor which is so attractive to the Imperial International Götterpurka Syndicate. They talk of a wage earner's loyalty to a firm as to a feudal lord. As if a man meditating in the mountains at sunset could think tenderly of the International Linoleum Combine as Roland in the mountains thought of the love of Charlemagne, his lord. The truth is that none of these systems, socialistic or plutocratic, has any such relation to the human soul. And in England, at least, the quarrel between them has become a hopeless tangle of cross purposes, a complete contrast between what people ask for and what they wish for. The millionaires are praising competition, which is the last thing they tolerate. And the trades unionists are praising state control, which is the very last thing they want. I believe the idea that the mob is fickle is really quite mistaken. It would be far truer to say that the critics of the mob are fickle, and it would be truer still to say that they are false. The masses want something very simple, and the classes are always promising to give it them by means of something very complicated. The masses get the complication without the gift, not because they are wrong in wanting the simple things, but because their superiors have been wrong in suggesting the elaborate one. Indeed, their superiors know they are wrong, though they are generally too superior to say so. They prove it by offering to the mob another entirely different but equally elaborate system. That also is offered as a way of doing the simple thing, and that also fails to do it. That is what happened in the English economic system, when the educated English first preached competitive commerce and then collectivist politics. That is what has happened through all recent English history. For instance, Cobbett, perhaps the greatest man in all that history, spoke for millions of men when he demanded what he called reform, the demand afterwards met by the Reform Bill. When that bill became an act of Parliament and was put into operation, the common people were disappointed with it, and Cobbett was disgusted with it. This was probably put down to the crankiness of Cobbett, and was certainly put down to the fickleness of popular opinion. But the attitude was not only reasonable, it was consistent and even continuous. It was rooted in the simple fact that the Reform Bill did not achieve reform. End of Section 8. The Sleepwalker and the State. Read by Michael Shane Craig Lambert, L.C. Section 9 of G.K. Chesterton in Vanity Fair magazine. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. G.K. Chesterton in Vanity Fair magazine by G.K. Chesterton. Section 9. The Doctor and the Doctrinaire. What the common people are commonly supposed to want, and what they really want. If I could give to the world a great psychological masterpiece, which is fortunately most improbable, I should throw it into the form of a drama or novel with the title of Dr. Fell. It would describe, with delicate realism, how that medical man, in spite of his medical degree and distinction, and the finished bedside manner which I feel sure he possessed, yet managed to miss a complete popularity, and that in a manner that has become a proverb. Most of the quieter scenes of the comedy would consist of the deathbeds of various kinds of people, covering all classes and types of society, who could not bring themselves to die in charity with their medical adviser, and ending with the poet whose dying curse still remains in our memory in the form of an immortal rhyme. The last tremendous scene of all, in which Dr. Fell is torn in pieces by a raging mob, who can only answer with inarticulate howls to the doctor's repeated and lucid question as to why they do not like him, that scene would perhaps allow the author to let himself go a little more. It would rise above the light play of psychology into the dignity of human and divine justice. But it would also be at best a prophecy, for it would represent something which, I regret to say, has not happened yet. For Dr. Fell is now a highly prosperous practitioner. He is not only a professional, but a political status. The state of modern times has given him more power than was ever given to the priest. In some places, he has been able to dry up all the drinks of historic humanity by pronouncing an Arabic word as a sort of charm or spell, the word alcohol. In other places, he is allowed to interfere with ordinary lovemaking, and to walk up to a wedding party which does not take his fancy, and stop the wedding. He calls it, I believe, eugenics. In England, he has been attached as a panel doctor to the poor under a compulsory scheme of insurance. In other words, the poor people do not like him, for such is his mystic destiny, but they are obliged to have him whether they like him or not. Dr. Fell as a politician. We will not here follow out the enquiry into the fine shades of this occult antipathy, or ask what nameless, neurotic influences lead some simple and ignorant man to dislike having his bride taken away, or his glass knocked out of his hand. I am here only using this medical gentleman as a convenient type and introduction to another truth. A truth about modern society which is best represented by such a medical metaphor. The more general question of whether all this cold and fishy science should be enforced by law on citizens who were once supposed to be free, I will not discuss here, though I may discuss it afterwards. But the case of Dr. Fell is very convenient as a simplification of something with which I wish to deal more immediately. It is the fundamental question of what men really want from the political and social system they endure. What they want is something very different from what they are said to want and supposed to want, and even, under certain peculiar circumstances, from what they will describe themselves as wanting. And the difference can be most clearly and compactly stated as the case of a doctor and a patient. And it goes far towards explaining that strange and sublime halo of universal hatred in which the dignified figure of Dr. Fell walks among his brethren. Let us picture as a pleasing fancy that you are very ill in bed, and that Dr. Fell or some other eminent physician is attending you. He recommends you to take tincture of tarantula, or what you will, and goes off on his official round. Nothing happens until he comes again sometime afterwards, and then he says, with a similar firmness, that cyanide of pandemonium, or words to that effect, is now indicated. When you are beginning to be a little tired of the bed, you are pleased to find that the matter has appeared to him in a new light, and that bichloride of Busterbango, I quote from memory, is undoubtedly the thing to exhibit. Now, at each of these stages, a message is probably sent round to the chemist, saying that you want certain things, that you want tincture of tarantula, that you urgently desire cyanide of pandemonium, that your will is strongly set in the direction of bichloride of Busterbango. I may not have the technical terms absolutely correctly, but the things are of the same type as objects of human desire. Now, the message to the chemist is strictly speaking incorrect. You do not want any of these things. You have never experienced any wave of will in their direction. What you want is your own body and arms and legs and the normal use of them. What you want is the sky and the open road and several square meals a day. In short, what you want is to get out of bed, and possibly even to get rid of the doctor. But you believe, and largely correctly, that the doctor and his chemicals will help you to reach this result. But you believe this on authority and indirectly. And there is no comparison between wanting these things in this sense and the simple and solid certainty of the things that you really do want. And this is exactly the position of the plain man in the presence of most modern social remedies. To say, as the politicians do, that the people want free trade, or want tariff reform, or want nationalization of this or that, is like saying that the patient loves quinine or longs for cod liver oil. The patient and the people both want something which the physician and the politician both undertake to get by means of these successive nostrums. Nor is it true, as I have said, that the mob is fickle about free trade or protection or individualism or socialism. We might as well charge the patient with cruelly deserting one medicine bottle in order to coquet with another. If anybody is fickle, it is the physician. And if anybody is fickle, it is the governing classes, who have passed through fashion after fashion of political philosophy, not the common people, who have always wanted one thing, and who want it still. The progressive vote and the little garden. Any real revolution must be a popular revolution, and any popular revolution must rise out of these simple things that simple people really want. Take, to begin with, the fact which is admittedly the first fact of all political economy, yet which is scarcely ever really felt by politicians or economists. What people want is not land nationalization, or taxation of land values, or some type of land tenure, or some type of landlord, but land. They want it in the same ultimate sense that they want not central heating, but heat, not water pipes, but water. What has made all men subconsciously sick of the politician, what has made him figure as a Dr. Fell, is that he wants men to worship this machinery and forget what it was supposed to manufacture. He wishes us to embrace the water pipes when they are as dry as the dry bones of his logic. He asks us to admire a sausage machine like a calculating machine in the abstract, and regardless of the fact that it produces no sausages. In the old pantomimes, the sausage machine used to cut up the policeman into sausages. And in this, as in so many of the old pantomimes, there is at least the rough suggestion of a solid social reform. An extremist might suggest that the politician as well as the policeman should be cut up into sausages. But cannibalism is a cultural and artistic movement too advanced for my taste. Besides, he would make such bad sausages. He would disappoint us in that, as in everything else, when it came to the practical test. The practical test is what the plain man really wants and what he really gets. The politicians are always trying to conjure with the names of things he has never wanted, except as a way of getting things he has never got. The politicians are always accusing him of deserting the Liberal Party or betraying the socialist cause or breaking up the Union or dismembering the Empire or splitting the progressive vote. And all the time, the real political question of what people want is much better expressed by what they say when they do not think they are talking politics at all. It is much better expressed by any poor cottage woman when she looks hastily down the village street and says, "Oh yes, I'd like a little garden." End of section 9. The Doctor and the Doctrinaire. Read by Michael Shane Craig Lambert, LC.
Section 10 of G.K. Chesterton in Vanity Fair magazine. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Heather Eney, G.K. Chesterton in Vanity Fair magazine by G.K. Chesterton. Hats, Houses, and Human Beings. What a free man wants is not money, but property. I might almost say that what a free man wants is not property, but proprietorship. So far as anything so deep can be defined in words, he desires, over some limited area, the mastery of material things. He may desire property as distinct from prosperity. He may even desire property at the expense of prosperity. This does not mean that a few men should have huge masses of property. Obviously, that condition is inconsistent with the ideal of the common man having property. It is self-evident, for instance, that the idea of landlords is the very opposite of the idea of men owning land. We should all see this instantly in another example. If it were clothes instead of fields, or hats instead of houses. We have only to imagine the majority of men running about bareheaded and overshadowed by a toppling pagoda of hats worn by one Jewish old clothes man, governing the whole country. As indeed it is very nearly the case now, except that the Jew has become successful enough as an old clothes man to dress himself in new clothes. But in that case, we certainly should not say that the habit of wearing hats was a custom of that country, nor can anybody say that the habit of owning land is a custom of our Commonwealth today. It is not customary, but exceedingly rare, and none the less rare because the exceptions are monstrous in size as well as in eccentricity. Unfortunately, the situation is worse even than this. Private property, the only real form of personal liberty, is not only rare as a social reality, but it is tolerably rare as a social ideal, except among the silent masses whose ideals are hardly more conscious than instincts. It is even rarer as a political ideal among the practical politicians. It is typical of the servile trend of our politics that the only political proposal of this kind has lingered only as a political joke. It is the expression 3 acres and a cow advocated by Joseph Chamberlain when he was acting in conjunction with that much more admirable and much less admired reformer Jesse Collings. It is also typical of that trend that success attended another scheme of Chamberlain's, that of old age pensions, because however human and helpful under the circumstances, it had a certain savor of outdoor relief for paupers. While his first scheme was merely jeered at, precisely it had the savor of independence and dignity for citizens. 9 acres and an elephant. 3 acres and a cow, therefore, is a thoroughly sane and sound ideal. Far more solid than that of 3 landlords and herds of cattle followed by herds of tenants. But if it is much saner than capitalism, it is also much saner than communism or collectivism. For a man owning 3 acres and a cow, it is not a substitute to propose that 3 men should own 9 acres and an elephant. There may be a sense in which a man can own the hind leg of an elephant, but it is not ownership in the sense of immediate mastery. He cannot make his new leg do what he likes, when the other 3 are doing something entirely different. The agitation and nervous strain of such a condition would be too much even for the largest elephant. An elephant must be treated as a whole, and his control by several men depends on the agreement of those men. All can have all of him, but none can have a part of him. Now, I do not discourage the public ownership of elephants or other large and somewhat ludicrous objects, such as town halls, post offices, government offices, and similar elephantine things. These public pachyderms move slowly, and are sometimes rather difficult to move at all. But they ought to exist, and they ought to be owned by the public. What I say is that they are not a substitute for a private house, as symbolized in heraldic style by a private cow. For instance, you can call a cow by a pet name to suit your own fancy, and few people have ever done this to a post office. And I need not say that the idea of a government department coming when it is called by its pet name is almost outside the sphere of practical politics. But it is quite a mistake to suppose that the case for a man having a whole cow to himself is merely a case for selfishness. Property alone sets a man free to give, as well as free to keep. It not only enables him to give the name to the cow, but to give the cow to the neighbors. So long as he shares, he never gives. He cannot give the elephant its own hind leg, and it is quite obvious, though curiously neglected, that he cannot do any such generous actions with any of the public things in which he merely shares as a citizen. Socialists of the Fabian sort may tell him that he does truly own the lamp-posts in the street, or the telegraph wires across the country. But the man cannot offer his friend a lamp-post as he offers him a cigar. He cannot offer to cut him off a length of telegraph wire on the public highway as he offers to cut him off a branch of blossom in a private garden. If a man is to be free to do these friendly things, he must also be free to do much more fantastic things. In short, the conflict between the private cow and the communal elephant does involve the idea of what some would call irresponsibility in this sense. That a man must be legally allowed to do many things that others would call mad if he is to be able to do the things touched with the fine madness of magnanimity. He must be allowed to call his cow Ashtaroth or Abracadabra if he is to be free to label half the milk for the poor children next door. He must be free to paint his house a bright pink with pea-green spots if he is to be free to open its doors in hospitality to the beggars on the road. There are many who would think one act as mad as the other, but it is obvious that however startling the external effects might appear, one act must always be as private as the other. I am not, I need hardly say, offering the least excuse for freaks of fashionable plutocracy when it really impinges upon public things. I am merely pointing out that there are some things that must remain private things, and that among them is not only any kind of owning, but any kind of giving. What is totally untenable is the view that an exact equivalent for the act of giving can be found in the act of sharing. And here again we should probably be guided aright if we only discovered what the real populace really wants. These truths would be immediately apparent if we turned from theories and systems about the poor to the poor themselves. It would be found that a very great deal of their desire for more wealth was a desire for the dignity that comes of dispensing courtesies and compliments. It is very largely because goods can mean gifts and homes can mean hospitality. The householder and his house. If a Renaissance comes, it will be by the victory of small things over big things. It will especially come by the victory of the inside of things over the outside. The cow will go in front of the elephant precisely because the cow can really belong to a man, while the elephant can only belong to a menagerie. The cow will jump over the moon, so to speak, though the moon is much larger of the two. The man will not be suited to the house, but the house to the man, though the house is much the larger of the two. The house will be painted not to match the street, but to match the householder, even if it is painted pink with green spots. In short, the householder controlling the house is himself a type of these two things. The smaller thing controlling the larger thing, and the thing inside controlling the thing outside. And he is thus the flat contrary of the whole tendency of recent progress, which is at once a rush and a routine. It has all been in the direction not only of the larger destroying the smaller, but of the external destroying the internal. A man ought to clothe himself with a house and garden, as he clothes himself with a hat and coat. As it is, a new house is built by a total stranger, who then looks round to find a man to fit it. In some cases, it is almost as little designed for the men who will live in it as the mice who will live in it. Men and mice alike seem to be small and even secretive animals, concealed only in the interior of a house. In the eyes of those magnificent managers of public works, who are thinking only of external facades of masonry and perspective of streets in a particular town of a particular type. Houses as man-traps. There are indeed poorer houses that might well be called man-traps, on the model of mouse-traps. But something outside designs them, and the larger sort also. There will be no renewal till the mouse is more than the mountain, till we begin again with the small and living thing from which all the large things have come. It is an old fable of disappointment that the mountain brought forth a mouse. But at least we should hardly be merely disappointed. We might even be mildly surprised if we happened to see a mouse bring forth a mountain. And that monstrous image has been the whole history of man. He is the small thing that has brought forth all the big ones. Man must begin at the beginning, or he will very soon come to the end. We are tangled up in the tail ends of everything, and we must disentangle them or they will strangle us. We are being cut to pieces by machinery of which we cannot find the handle and have wholly forgotten the use. We must find not only the handle, but the hand. Not only the use, but the motive. We must get back to the man behind all machines, and the desire behind all systems. And the simpler the man, and the more direct the desire, the better. Among these really democratic desires, I have put first this primary desire to possess, not to exchange or employ or exploit, but to possess. It is lost in the complexities both of capitalism and collectivism, but it still exists as a thing and not a theory. It has been called, for convenience, distributism. But you cannot really make a word for it ending in ism any more than you can call first love feminism or the fear of death a new disease with the name of thanatophobia. As with first love or the fear of death, the people who feel it do not look in a dictionary for long words to express it. You may not hear about it from labor leaders, but you will hear about it from laborers. Under every discouragement and every desperation of a whole social system driving the other way, it is apparent among the poor in everything they do and say, in the manner of laying out the tiniest garden, in the manner of decorating the meanest room. At present, the whole process consists of sending a policeman to trample down that garden, or an inspector to rout out that room. When that whole process is reversed, the Commonwealth will begin to be renewed. When the garden grows upon the street, and the small room begins to alter the greater city, the new Renaissance will have begun. End of section 10, read by Heather Eney.
Section 11 of G.K. Chesterton in Vanity Fair magazine. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. G.K. Chesterton in Vanity Fair magazine by G.K. Chesterton. The Wreck of the Modern Machine. By far the happiest and most hopeful news that can now be brought to human beings is the news that they are on the wrong road and have come to the wrong place. That is why all real progress is founded on the fall of man, and not on evolution or any such early Victorian muddles in the mind. There are enough early Victorians of an evolutionary sort left alive to permit the impression that there is something highly mystical and even superstitious in talking about the fall of man. Yet this truth can be illustrated in the most practical and even prosaic way by any visible and bodily fall of man. If you are motoring in your superb car to your magnificent country seat, in company with 2 judges and a bishop, or some other select members of your social circle, it is always possible that you may come to a smash, and actually fall into a ditch. For some appreciable time you may find yourself, let us say, sitting on the bishop's head, with the judge lying on top of you upside down with his legs waving in the air. Such things can happen to the wealthy and are among the consolations of the wise. Let us agree that even then your admirable sanity and self-control will enable you to exchange lucid and detached specimens of polished conversation. The judge will be able to explain with judicial logic that you were undoubtedly on the wrong side of the road. The bishop will still be able to offer religious consolation in a somewhat muffled voice from below. You yourself, I assume, will treat the whole situation with that charming touch of humor which is the finest grace of hospitality. But it is clear that the cheerfulness of this wayside chat will depend on the admission that the situation is something rather out of the way, even in the literal sense of being a little bit off the road. Bright, embracing conversation in the ditch will depend on the confession that you are in the ditch. You will not be so successful if you treat the ditch as the destination, and infuse into your hospitality the final joy of one welcoming his friends to his fireside. It will not do to maintain that sitting on somebody else in a ditch is actually what you mean by your country seat. Though in pure logic it certainly is a seat, and one generally only to be found in the more rural and secluded parts of the country. It will not do to suggest that your journey has already come to its appointed end, though it has certainly come to a positive stop, and has for the moment ended. All possibility of repairing the car and resuming the journey must start from the recognition of a mistake. And all conception of getting back onto the right road must begin with the confession of having taken the wrong road. The wrong road. And this is pretty much the present position of our society and of any chances of its renewal. The first fact is that we have come to the wrong place, and the first obstacle is any sort of pretense that it is even relatively the right place. Modern industrial and capitalistic society is an exceedingly dirty ditch, and we are sitting on better people than bishops. We are doing the unwisest thing of all. We are sitting on the chauffeur. But it is not only true that we are in the wrong place, it is largely true that we have long been on the wrong road. The directions we have ourselves given to the chauffeur have been almost invariably wrong directions. If there is one outstanding and startling fact in recent history, it is, I think, the series of blunders made by the educated and especially by the learned. The cultured were admiring the Kaiser for his military efficiency and his empire of education, while the ignorant were making game of him because of his moustaches. The ignorant were right, as they often are. The whole Teutonic theory of history, which had its last triumph in the invasion of Belgium, was a thing known to the rich and not to the poor. It was actually taught by the rich to the poor, fortunately without much success. Fortunately for us, a bricklayer was seldom found embracing a Prussian and hailing him as the true Germanic overlord, leading a folk wandering to renew the decadent nations. It was culture that supported Kultur, and fortunately for us, the nonsense and the nightmare perished together. But we still have a lingering prejudice that the Prussian path was the right path, simply because it had so long been our own path. The name given to it is organization, or in plainer words, machinery. And we still think we can reach some sort of renaissance by refurbishing and cleaning and oiling that old machinery. Such a notion, to begin with, is contrary to the very nature of every renaissance in history. A renaissance in its nature is the finding of something that is new, because it is old. But it is only new because it is very old. The thing renewed may be quite a remote thing, it can never be merely a recent thing. The great Renaissance, which has given its name to every other Renaissance, produced artists precisely because it proceeded from antiquaries. It modeled the new world in ancient arts that were not only morally dead, but materially and literally buried. The French Revolution and its great prophetic precursor, the American Revolution, went back to a republican simplicity which it could only find far away in the small republics of antiquity. But modern men seem to imagine that they can renew the modern world with mere machinery of the modern world. They seem to think that if they can only make economic power more concentrated, or education more compulsory, or the division of labor more detailed and ingenious, or in short, the 20th century, like the 19th century, only more so, then youth and hope will at last return to the world. This is just as if men had hoped in the last dark decline of medievalism, and they could then produce Leonardo and Shakespeare, by making further complications in heraldry, by making a new kind of division as well as parti per pale, or new posture for the lion between the rampant and passant. It is as if men thought they could refresh the world with the freedom of the French and American revolutions by adding new statues to Versailles or new sticks in waiting to the court of George III. Science as a panacea. We are especially told, for instance, that science will lead us out of the modern tangle. It does not seem to occur to anybody that science had a good deal to do with leading us into it. At any rate, those who consistently use the name of science consistently led us into it. Anthropological science was made the excuse for glorifying the tribe which was supposed to be Teuton and turned out to be Prussian. Economic science was made the excuse for permitting the inhuman competition which has culminated in capitalism. The science of the 19th century systematically taught us that the worst ethics were the best economics. Chemical and mechanical science have done at least as much for the infliction of wounds as for the healing of them. They have produced such a renaissance of torture and poison that even the men like Mr. H.G. Wells, who put their trust in the tools of science, have to cry aloud for a new cosmopolitan system merely to protect us against the weapons of science. All these are but proposals for driving further in the direction that has already landed us in the ditch. If any renaissance comes, it will not come from the things we are cultivating, but from the things we are neglecting. They are the things which we are needing, because they are the things we are neglecting. Because organized education utterly ignores the natural tradition of culture from father to son, the real culture will come from some individual fathers really educating individual sons. Because organized militarism has largely forgotten chivalry and chance fighting for justice, justice will probably be vindicated by some chance fight. Because property concentrated in huge fortunes or large estates has lost all personality and meaning, property will be rediscovered by some small man who insists upon managing his own small garden. The pompous impersonal things among which we have moved for so long will be confronted with the pugnacious personal things which they were once supposed to represent, but which they have long been banded together to betray. It may seem like a war of small things against great, but the small things will be real, where the great are unreal. It may seem like the contrast between a man and a giant, but in truth it will only be like the contrast between a man and his own gigantic shadow at evening. End of section 11.
Section 12 of G.K. Chesterton in Vanity Fair magazine. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Larry Wilson. G.K. Chesterton in Vanity Fair magazine by G.K. Chesterton. The Next Renaissance. Thoughts on the Structure of the Future. 12. The Mad Hatter and the Sane Householder. Modern society is intrinsically insecure, because it is based on the notion that all men will do the same thing for different reasons. A virile and vigorous society should rather be based on the notion that all men will do different things for the same reason. It should be rather like a carnival to which people come in habits of every cut and color, clad as crusaders or Chinamen, red Indians or blue devils, but all upon a common agreement to enjoy themselves, or even perhaps to enjoy some positive and popular thing, such as a patriotic anniversary or a church festival. Modern society, so far from being like a carnival, is much more like a funeral, but it is most of all like a meeting at which everybody turns up in black, but only because some think it is a funeral, and some a financial meeting, and some a political conspiracy, and some the preliminary to a duel. It is as if they had all come in the right clothes to the wrong house. Modern men have all the same conventions and all different convictions, and that is the exact equivalent of doing one common thing for 20 contradictory reasons. We have made a brotherhood of hats without making the least attempt to have a brotherhood of heads. Yet it is obviously more desirable that the brains should work in a more brotherly fashion, and having so worked, they may quite legitimately signal their brotherly thoughts to each other in the shapes of the most varying and fantastic hats like pyramids and pagodas, hats like the Eiffel Tower or the Great Wheel. There is no harm in the Mad Hatter, so long as he keeps his madness only for hats. Or to shift the metaphor from hats to houses, consider the houses in a new street in the suburbs of one of our large towns. All these towns are as like each other as a row of buttons on a coat, or a row of uniforms in a regiment. Yet they have none of the common code of honor which may give a regiment unity, which may make a uniform stand for something more than uniformity. They are not numbered like soldiers, but rather like convicts. And as within the head of any convict may be the hell of a quite solitary crime, so in the house or under the hat of any suburban clerk may be the limbo of a quite separate philosophy. The first man may be a complete materialist, and feel his own body as a horrible machine manufacturing his own mind. He may listen to his own thoughts as to the dull ticking of a clock. The man next door may be a Christian Scientist, and regard his own body as something rather less substantial than his own shadow. He may come almost to regard his own arms and legs as delusions, like moving serpents in the dream of delirium tremens. The third man in the street may not be a Christian Scientist, but on the contrary a Christian. He may live in a fairy tale, as his neighbors would say, a secret but solid fairy tale, full of the faces and presences of unearthly friends. The fourth man may be a Theosophist, and only too probably a vegetarian. And I do not see why I should not gratify myself with the fancy that the fifth man is a devil worshipper. Anyhow, nobody with any experience of the modern middle class, of which I am myself a particular and I hope harmless variety, will deny that the class contains by this time the most fundamental differences of faith and even fantasy. Each one of those houses may be as separate as a padded cell in an asylum, and each man may be as lonely as a lunatic. The Four Men and the Lamp-Post. Now, whether or no this sort of variety is valuable, it is clear that this sort of unity is shaky. To expect that all men for all time will go on thinking different things, and yet doing the same things, is a doubtful speculation. It is not founding society on a communion, or even on a convention, but rather on a coincidence. Four men may meet under the same lamp-post. One to paint it pea green as part of a great municipal reform, one to read his breviary in the light of it, one to embrace it with accidental ardor in a fit of alcoholic enthusiasm, and the last merely because the pea green post is a conspicuous point of rendezvous with his young lady. But to expect this to happen night after night for an interminable period is unwise. The lover may marry the lady and dispense with lamp-posts. The social reformer may pass on to paint the council hall, the cathedral, and all the other sights the same bright and pleasing color. The drunkard may happen to embrace a policeman instead of a post. And generally each traveler may go about his particular business, whether it is painting the town green or painting it red. Particular causes, as in the case of modern society, may bring these people together a fair number of times, but it is obvious that the nature of things does not tend to bring them together, but rather ultimately to drive them apart. The nature of things is tending ultimately to drive all the elements of our society apart. The Christian Scientist will not desire a society in which the materialist next door can get him punished for not calling in a medical man for his family. The Christian will want his own cathedral, and may conceivably not want it painted green like the municipal lamp-post. What holds them together now is merely an accident. the accident that so far their creeds have not often clashed in practice. But the single case of Christian Science is enough to show that there is danger of a clash, not to say a crash. The materialism of Utopia. In common with the happy mob of most of my fellow men, I am somewhat chilled by the description of utopias. This is not because they are too idealistic, but on the contrary because they are much too materialistic. They are full of that fashionable notion which betrays so much the servile spirit of our social reform, the notion of giving good conditions for the living and laboring of men. It is the best comment on this phrase that it is the same which is used for pigs and cows. It is also worth noting that it is not used for men whose domesticity we connect with any kind of dignity. Those who gave Lambeth Palace to the Archbishop of Canterbury, or Fulham Palace to the Bishop of London, did not say in a sweeping fashion that they were creating good conditions for bishops. A nobleman recently gave a very beautiful country house to be the country seat of the Prime Ministers of England. But I am sure he did not say that he wished the class of Prime Ministers to work under clean and healthy conditions. It is part of a subconscious morality, or rather immorality, that regards workmen as slaves and slaves as beasts of burden. And it is the familiar fault of utopias that they regard human happiness as static, whereas the real human happiness is dynamic, not to say dramatic. If men are happy in Utopia, it will not be because there are good roads, but because they meet somebody or something on the road unexpectedly. If they are happy in their homes, it will not be because of the conditions of the home, but rather because of the crises of home. Because it is in the home that things really happen, that children are born or couples betrothed. For these reasons, I have not cast these random suggestions about social renewal into the form of a utopia, or any picture of a perfect state. Nevertheless, it will be well to conclude, for the sake of argument, by conceiving a general state of things which should be the object of social effort. And that state of things, I imagine, not as in most utopias, more orderly in the sense of more uniform, but more irregular in the sense of more varied than the present state of things. The Creed and the Christmas. I do not see why human equality should not be at least as varied as heraldry. I do not see why every coat should not be at least as individual as a coat of arms. Every family, so far as possible, should have its own land or means of production. And as it will grow what it likes, cook what it likes, and, a very vital point, brew and drink what it likes, so there is no reason why it should not weave what it likes and wear what it likes. There may even be a tendency to such superficial abuses of freedom as there is often in an aristocracy. The aim of a peasantry is not so much to abolish squirearchy as to make all men squires, and there are often a certain number of mad squires. Between these extremes, however, there would be every shade of humor and human variety, and the home would become once more original, by becoming once more an origin. Hospitality would gain a new meaning in the gift of novelty, and have some of the advantages of travel. The house would no longer be merely a box. It would at least be a Christmas box. But if all this is true, we can only return to the first truth, that we cannot have a Christmas box without Christmas. We can never have all this artistic variety until we have spiritual unity. As the common theory of heraldry alone made possible the varied colors of coats and shields. At present we have the contrary condition of being externally similar and internally torn asunder. And that spiritual unity will either never return, or it will return with the return of the creed for which Christmas stands. It will come as a Christmas box, or it will not come at all. End of section 12. End of G.K. Chesterton in Vanity Fair magazine by G.K. Chesterton.